I was struck by all three of the presentations. They actually touched me in a personal way, actually. I worked at the Fed, so thank you for giving them.
So you know that they're research operations.
It's very,
and
it's
we
very
pay
good.
for their research. I always say my students, we pay, simply with the IMF.
It's
we
very,
can use it and cite it.
very good stuff. I was at HUD for 3 years, and the international office reported to me. So when the UN Rapporteur report came out, it landed on my desk. So I am very familiar with that report as well, talking about the state of human rights in the United States. And then all the stuff on foreclosure, I spent a lot of time on those issues. And finally, the stuff on race and fear, stop and frisk and inequality. It struck me that the Bedrosian Center has been actually talking about this a lot in the past year. So we just did a podcast yesterday that came out yesterday on Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, about race and being a black male in America. And we've done we did a podcast on Didier Fassin's book about stop and frisk was in Paris. So if you are not subscribed to our podcast, you should do that.
And I will too.
That's the end of my commercial. But I wanted to say that you guys talked about different things, but basically the same thing. And it was really interesting to hear the different takes around this basic issue. So I'm going to try to walk us through a conversation where we try to touch on a number of things. I want to make sure we talk about power, the rules of the game, exclusion, expulsion, norms, a voice, and then I want to make sure that we spend some time talking about the ability for us to institutionalize access, institutionalize participation in a meaningful way. And as we think about the institutionalization, I want to go to your indeterminacy issue, because I feel like we have this tension between order and chaos, right? And indeterminacy
It's in between. It could
somewhat
go either way.
somewhat in between, but I think there's always this fear about spiraling,
Yeah.
right? And so, but we'll get to all that. I wanted to start with the question that you ended with, which is the question of who owns the city. And I want us to think about that in the context of what the answer to that question means for public space, right? So does the ownership of the city really affect what public space is and how it's going to play out?
Well, I mean, my concern is, I didn't quite develop that, but it's a well-known fact, is the development of mega projects, which kill urban tissue. And this is spreading. In New York, it's amazing. I've lived in Lower Manhattan for 30 years, and now you have more and more towers, on the main streets. And so the image that I have is that when you make these mega projects, which often involve a block or two, etc., you're doing two things. You are eliminating little streets, little squares, little messy, little government office. They're modest, but it is a bit of your home if you are a modest income, whatever. And you are also developing killing the street, because those mega projects, whatever is around them, hardly functions like a street. The street functions when there is tissue. A main thoroughfare is a traffic-dominated street, but it's the little streets. Those. By street, by the way, I mean more than just street. I mean indeterminate space that is not marked for one function or whatever. So for me, the question of the mega projects is that they and say. We now have in cities in Europe, for instance, streets, places like Potsdamer Platz. I don't know if anybody. Those streets are private streets. They used to be public streets. And in the reconstruction, they look like streets. But why, if you do something that you shouldn't be doing, you immediately know, okay, it's private. So this is a sort of an almost insidious development, One mega project is one thing, but mega project after mega project, that is an issue, I would say.
I think that is an issue. Ananya, I want to ask you this question in the context of the anti-eviction movement. Do you think the outcomes how do you think the outcomes would differ if ownership were conceived in a different way, right? So we have the city, we have the set of rules.
Right.
how does that play out in the context of an eviction campaign in Chicago?
Well, let me back up a bit and say, in connection to the talks given by Margaret and Saskia and this broader question of who owns the city, I think the reason why the three talks had a resonance with each other is, one, I think we were drawing attention to a moment of global financialization and what that means, and that even the concentration of wealth and income is, and how that proceeds, is not immediately apparent and visible. In other words, if we are to look at the continuing securitization of debt and the enormous profits being made on it, that answer to the question of who owns the city is a complex one. So there's a really important chart about spiraling corporate profits post-Great Recession. If we've been paying attention to the headlines, a chunk of that comes out of renewed forms of subprime lending. So what's interesting about movements like the Chicago anti-eviction campaign is that they are really onto that. They get it. They get that the foreclosure crisis is not over. They get that new forms of subprime lending are happening. And therefore, for them to be able to assert a claim to the city, those are the global, almost invisible, less tangible forces that they have to fight. Right? I think the second piece of this speaks to the point that Margaret made, that one can think about ownership as owning property, claiming a home, which is partly what the movement does. But I think what got me interested in the movement is that they also work with frameworks of racial dispossession. That blacks were never meant to be in the city. They were never meant to be in Chicago, right? There's a long history here of slavery. So if we are to talk about ownership, we need to think about earlier moments when people were owned, who then was considered even to be human. And it is in that understanding that they then forge a language of human rights. So I think the other way of thinking about who owns the city, which of course has been made apparent by Black Lives Matter, is the unfinished work of civil rights, and who even gets to be a person. So I'm very interested in the work I'm currently doing. It's a broad project on the urban land question, in this relationship between property and personhood, and where then a different politics of ownership, of what I'm calling possessive collectivism, might come into play that is not possessive individualism, which is partly that making of space with which you ended, the right to be able to make space rather than space being made for you.
So Margaret, did you want to?
I just want to say that I think the frontier of public space activism is the challenge of property rights and changing the boundaries between public and private, which has actually happened many times, and those boundaries are continually being redrawn. But I would say the most significant and the most unsettling is the challenge to property rights through various kinds of public space activism. And I was interested in Ananya's talk because it was very explicitly about that.
So I agree with that. When I was listening to I made a note when you listed the 6 rights. The last right was the right to make your own spaces, right? And that is a direct challenge to the notion of property rights. I wrote conflict with property rights as my note. And I think that is true. And it is interesting, Ananya, your work is not even, it says we can even challenge that in a private ownership context to make it a more collective issue. I want to ask your thoughts on two issues on this, which is this question of rights and who gets to decide what the rights are. And if we think, Margaret, you talked a lot about how we have this history of a small number of people being in the room to decide. How do we meaningfully broaden that to change our notion of what rights should be?
Well, don't you think that happens through social struggles and continuously demanding rights, and then the responses of legal entities, the changing of laws, in a sense also the public recognition of those rights? And that's an ongoing battle with many arenas. So I basically just see these struggles, and I mean, public space is never fixed. It's constantly being redefined by demands and struggles.
Project.
Well, yeah.
So I mean, yes, But I mean, if we look at those struggles and we did an assessment of what's happened as a result of them, you know, there are some that have done better than others. You both talked about the Occupy movement. Some would argue it generated a lot of energy. It hasn't resulted in a lot of change, right? And so do you have thoughts on approaches that there are necessary conditions in order for those movements to then translate into meaningful change? And any of you can.
Well, I was curious about what happened to that UN mission report that landed on your desk. As JR said, no UN blue helmets, of course.
There were no UN blue helmets. We certainly didn't call for any.
Yes, yes.
No, so it was interesting because I think when that came out, it's actually, this goes across all three of you, this conflict between global notions of the right and then national, local notions of the right. And when that report came out, what it really triggered is initially, almost immediately, this discussion of, is the rapporteur talking about things that we have as local rights? Or is she trying to impose a global right on our country? Right? And it's that tension that got, I mean, personally, I think they said, if we're going to really engage in this, we've got to go to the Congress and have them reconceive what our set of rights is. And that, as a political, I mean, you've seen the Congress, right? So engaging in that, I think, was going to require far more political capital than this president had, particularly as a black president. That was going to be extremely difficult.
So I want to make 2 points in relation to that. One of them is what I find useful in holding in simultaneous view these uneven geographies of North and South, is it allows us to take rights talk and think about its complexities. And the reason why I have resolutely remained in urban planning is I think there's I'm very drawn to the contradiction that is inherent in the liberal notion of rights. So Margaret raised the work of Don Mitchell, and Mitchell repeatedly argues that in many cases rights are claimed in opposition to the state, and yet the state remains perhaps the main guarantor of rights. That is a contradiction. It's central to liberal democracy. I'm very drawn to that contradiction and very frustrated by it. But for me, the state, however we conceptualize it, is therefore a particular terrain of rights talk and rights politics and rights work.
Let me add something. So I think of citizenship as an incompletely theorized contract between the state and the people. And I like that notion that is incompletely theorized. So when you look at the history of citizenship, whatever it may have been called, it has varied enormously. Starting in the 1980s, there is another change. We, the citizens, begin to lose rights. I was writing about that already back then. I sent it a little book. And corporates gain rights, extreme rights sometimes. They broke, I mean, I don't want to go into the details. So there are two things, and there is now a third thing. We have a little sort of a network which is revisiting the notion of banishment, not as a that you really expel, not as something that out of the country, but out of a livelihood, out like what is happening to young black men. That's a kind of banishment. They are out. You showed that.
This is the mass incarceration.
The mass incarceration.
The stop and frisk, the harassment on the streets, all those things.
That, you know, what can you? So again, my question then. But I have forever this engagement with the terms. So is the language that we're using for it, that is all descriptive language. Do we need to interrogate that language itself to get at something deeper? You know, we need that language, mass incarceration, abuse of rights, imprisonment that is unwarranted, et cetera, because that's the language of the law, the language of contractual arrangements. But is there something deeper happening? So one of the things that I did in my little expulsions book is the whole development of private prisons, which is a very particular setup. Hey, you run it like a hotel. You want to fill those beds. Then you have the 3 hits and you have a whole sort of arrangements that, but anyhow, so how are they different from internally displaced people's camps? Of course, they are totally different, but I'm interested in seeing how a kind of logic develops and installs itself in so many different spaces. So one in my section that I call The World's Displaced, I have private prisons, which are expanding in many countries, though the United States is definitely exhibit number one, and I have internal displaced peoples. Totally different trajectories, different origins, but when you begin to look at it through that eye, you see that these are dynamics that are implanting themselves, in many, many situations. And so something really seriously bad is happening that takes it beyond discrimination. The language of discrimination is almost not enough. Racism then is more powerful, but again, I think this is a, and then you bring in this loss of habitat that I see also. This is the beginning of a new history, I think, even though a lot of familiar is in there too.
But I listening to you, it did get me to think about the mass shooting yesterday, and the president's comment about how we report on these the same way, we have we police it the same way, we do the aftermath the same way, and all of these issues about the challenges, the homeless, right, the tent cities, all these things. The tent cities are not far from here, right? They're not invisible, but they are invisible, right? We've made it easy for them to be so familiar that they're not noticed, right? It's just your brain naturally clears out things that are so familiar that you know, and you know what it means for you, right? And that's what a lot of these things have become. And so it becomes more difficult to unpack them and to really diagnose in meaningful ways. I wanted to talk about this in the context, Margaret. I thought your comments on Jane Jacobs were very interesting, because I love Jane Jacobs. I talk about her in all my classes because I think that I think that her generic characterization of how the world can play out does not necessarily exclude anybody, right? In principle, it doesn't. Now, in practice, it very well could, and it necessarily will. I wanted to ask you, do you think that these exclusions must happen? Like, do you think it's a foregone conclusion that if we set up any kind of public space, there will be some implicit exclusion of someone?
I think there is no totally inclusive public space, and that it always reflects the society that the public space is in. It's not some abstract concept. It actually is always embedded in a particular social circumstance, and I know of no circumstance where there is no discrimination. So that's a kind of utopian idea. And I think you're allowed to be, if you're, say, a young black man, you're allowed to be in many spaces, but you're not there in the same, you don't have the same rights to that space. You're there on sufferance, and you have to actually almost prove that you should be there or could be there rather than not being there. And I think that's definitely something that happens in the United States, especially with design spaces that have a kind of a purification aesthetic that really appeals to a certain kind of middle-class taste, middle-class activities, et cetera.
But middle class, you say middle class white activities.
Middle-class white
sensibilities.
activities, yes.
Because it was, I'm not a historian, but I really liked your discussion about the transformation of Central Park, right, and its uses and blending ideas about what public space should be and how it should play out, and that now as ownership has changed, the notion of the park is changing and it's reverting back to perhaps a more exclusionary framework and structure. That's really interesting, and I think that there's definitely more to think about that.
Well, can I say something?
Yeah,
As a
you can say- of
historian,
course.
we always think about change over time. And I guess I'm hearing an apocalyptic scenario from you, Saskia. And I think that it seems things go back and forth. If you look at Central Park, it started off being very exclusive. It opened up. It actually opened up under Robert Moses. He was the person who opened the park up the most, so that's ironic. And now it's being closed. It opened up in the 60s even more, and now it's being closed down. So I guess I don't see a trajectory, a historical trajectory.
ebb and
I see
flow.
various struggles that work and not even permanently. And in a sense, there's just a kind of arena or field of activity, especially in terms of public space. I'm not speaking globally or about the economy, since I'm not an economist, I know nothing. But I think in terms of struggles over public space, there is no historical trajectory of narrative of loss or narrative of victory.
But I think that, I mean, things are changing. Cities are becoming old and decaying, and if you don't have the money, you know, there are embedded trajectories. And when I look at the dead land and dead water, there's much more of it than there was 50 years ago. And moreover, I also should say, like I indicated, you know, we have an expansion of glamour zones that look beautiful, perfect, incredibly well accoutred and great infrastructure. And then we have those extreme other conditions. So I do think that, I find it difficult to say, especially if you looked at cities, that there is no history there.
I say there's no, I mean, there's many changes over time.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't even necessarily agree with your
City, how it changed.
description of city, because it seems to exclude suburbs.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I would accept the suburb as being part of the city.
But I'm not speaking as an urbanist. I'm speaking about certain systematicities that we need in order to, you know, have these encounters between powerless, and so that the powerless don't sort of disappear from the map. This is not an urbanist's account. So absolutely, you can.
But I do think this notion of trajectory matters, right? And you know, if you think about all the conversation about the 1%, all the hoopla about Thomas Piketty's book, Inequality and Capital, right? It's the notion that are we sure that there's an ebb and flow? Or is there a tipping point beyond which you are necessarily going to wind up, you know, with a tremendous concentration that then empowers a small number of folks, right?
But isn't the question about human agency? And I particularly liked Ananya's talk because it was really focused on a small but very interesting group of people who are claiming agency in a very large way. And again, I mean, is there human agency in this giant system? And what can people actually do? And what are the limits and what are the opportunities for human agency, I think is a huge question.
So that's a fundamental question. I like that question, and we're going to have every person here answer it. So, is there human agency?
But see, I don't want to use that language. So what do I say? I say when powerlessness becomes complex, when they get to make a history. I don't want the language that is sort of invitation not to think. You use agency, but this is me, the researcher, me, the theorist, you know. If I'm over dinner talking, I mean, I also use agency, but you know, I of course I believe that it's agency, but agency has become a word that has lost specificity, you know. I mean, finance has agency as well, right? I mean, you have to say that, right? Or not? Right? So I want to nail it down to what I'm interested in, and I don't include the suburbs, because I want these complex spaces where certain histories can be made that cannot be made in suburbs. Now, I know that some suburbs are now becoming cities. We can disagree, but I look at the world also. I mean, you know, I don't know. I don't want to become unfriendly. I just operate on another zone, you know, and it's a global space, and my tools are very different from a planner's tools.
But I do think, I mean, I do think you actually do believe that there's agency.
Of course I believe there is agency.
I mean,
but I use other language.
You just say it a different way.
Yeah,
I mean, you
right.
said, you know, one of the things I thought was really noteworthy about when you talk about people that live in cities, they have an ability to say, we are here.
Exactly.
Right? That is declaring agency, and that is, to some extent, what happens in this anti-eviction movement.
So what I'm interested in is about, you know, how do we think about historical change? And my preference is not to think teleologically, but rather to think about particular historical conjunctures and what the contradictions and antagonisms are at that moment, and to be able to think about historical conjunctures as also having within them potentiality. Right? And so I think about the historical conjunctures at which Central Park, the Great Depression, had its tent city, right? Other moments when, in fact, it's being again sanitized. So, in fact, that there isn't one linear trajectory for something like Central Park. There isn't one linear trajectory for increasing income inequality because it's not inevitable. We can see moments at which it was different, and I think paying attention to the historical conjunctures at which potentialities exist, to be able to seize that moment, even if that moment lasts only for this long, is really crucial, because the flip side of that chart, where the 2 hours of the crisis is replaced by spiraling corporate profits, is that there are also those 2 hours of potentialities. And I'm very interested in the work I currently do in thinking about that, but also I want to say that a lot of the conversation we've been having here, because of what we presented, has been focused on the global north. And I think thinking from and in the global north, of course, lends ourselves now to thinking apocalyptically, because we're mired in a politics of austerity. I think many of these issues look a bit different when we think about the global south. So I've been doing research during this last sabbatical year in India, Brazil, and South Africa. And there is a lot to do gloom and doom about in those contexts. But Professor Devi and I were having this conversation a few days ago. One of the policies I'd been studying in India, which is not going to be implemented by the current government, is a policy that gave us hope. It was the first national urban land reforms framework, right? It was going to create legal recognition and social protection for slum dwellers and squatter settlements. It comes out of the research that scholars like her had done. It came out of activism. There was a national government that could not therefore be read as the long march of global neoliberalization, but in fact was engaged in a project of social democracy. I'm very interested in what is that conjuncture, what makes that happen. We lost the moment, right? We might be able to regain it, but it matters to be able to analyze it and theorize it and think about what that potentiality was. And a lot of that potentiality, I would argue, is made possible through poor people's movements.
But
So
you know,
I-
when I was
so-
looking at the global south, I mean, most of my story was about the global south.
So I would say
And
simultaneous
I grew up in
with
Latin
that.
America, and I am working in a whole bunch. I mean, you know, there are these new geographies
Sure.
that I don't buy the north-south divide. I think that it exists, but there are new geographies of centrality that cut across with great ease. And they're very specific geographies, and they cut across east-west. You know, so global north, global south, it's a reality, but there are other intersectionalities, if you want, that are happening here. So Luanda, capital of Angola, hey, she's now a platform that is being built up because of the wealth, the natural wealth in Angola. She's part of a geography of centrality. You know, though it is a place where you can barely find a hotel, but they're building them now. So there is a kind of aggressive dynamism that it doesn't make sense to just, I mean, you looked at Central Park, okay, that's in the north, right? I mean, this is in New York. But you know, a lot of the story of everything that I talked about, these are histories that are being made across.
And I'm suggesting
I
that there are
mean,
other histories also
of
being
course
made.
there are other
So, for example, that
histories.
alongside those new geographies of centrality, we also have other centralities. So I'm thinking about massive conditional cash transfer programs, which many have dismissed as neoliberal, but that I think are
absolutely.
significant
Sure.
on the ground in places like Brazil and Mexico, the likes of which we will not see in our lifetimes
Yeah.
in the north, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, the South,
I
therefore,
don't
is a
disagree
project
with
of
that. I mean, you're talking
governance,
like, I don't
which
disagree.
has dispossession,
Yeah.
but where new forms of welfare and human development are also being made, and that is a bit different than the agency of, say, poor people individually or collectively. So I'm very interested in those reconstituted geographies as well.
So I agree with you certainly on the fact that we need to understand those preconditions and those set of circumstances that allow movements to become action items that transform the rules of the game. I think that's essential. I do think, though, that, and I will agree with you that nothing is a foregone conclusion, right? That we're not necessarily only going in one direction at any one time. I do think, though, that as conditions change and different coalitions are able to make different rules, they're going to skew those rules to their advantage to the extent that they can, and we need to be sensitive to those possibilities as well. So that's going to be true in an India context, that's going to be true in a South African context, it's going to be true in an Egyptian context, right? All these places are facing the same challenge.
Yeah, I'm Alfonso Morales, and I would like to just say that indeterminacy, I'd like to tag on where you started. Indeterminacy is not the absence of rules of engagement. It's not. Right? What it is the presence of purpose, problems, situated interactions, etc. Right? So what makes a city, right, are those people with their purposes going about their activities, right, in these different ways, and I think that's what we saw illustrated. So then, to Margaret's point, she critiqued Gell for imposing assumptions across places. That's fine, but in the absence of our own assumptions, behavioral assumptions, we're not making a, I think we ought to have something to say about how we theorize people's behavior. And so, from that perspective, I think Ananias made clear some behavioral assumptions. She referenced Lockean theory of property rights, right? In terms of investing labor with in a place to make a claim on it, right? She made implications about the assumptions she had her account of the behavior she observed, of the activities she was part of and observed, had everything to do with the indeterminacy of that situation. That's it.
Okay.
Do you have any react? Do you agree with him?
I just want to say that indeterminacy is a, it's a variety of conditions, and I said indeterminate, and as I said, a lot of what is present in a city is not necessarily marked by indeterminacy, or we would go crazy. The point for me is more, if the powerless are going to make histories, economies, cultures, if they're going to have the possibility of saying, we're here, estamos presentes, then you need particular types of spaces besides all the other things you need. If you had certain laws that prevent people from being in any public space, you're eliminating. So I just wanted, this is a very abstract feature, and I was trying to find a language, a term, that was not the overused, always the same words, that they really are invitations not to think. So now I notice that whenever I do this kind of a talk and I bring up indeterminacy, people are actually wondering, what the hell is she talking about? And I think, no, I know that.
No,
But I think that's okay. We need to because the cities have also undergone so many transformations. We, the citizens, we are losing rights. Everywhere we're losing them. So
I do think. I mean, I understood what you meant.
Yeah.
But I do think when people hear indeterminacy, life is random. There are things that happen to us all the time.
that's right.
And
That can also be it, right?
And the question is, how much randomness do we want, right? That there is an ongoing, and the planning profession tries to create some structure.
Yeah.
And the question is, how much structure?
There's a planning profession.
We have some planners here, so
Me too, but
yeah. But,
That's the point.
no, that's exactly right.
That is indeterminacy. But I wanted to just pick up
No,
on
but
that.
Inde, let me
Yeah.
just finish on indeterminacy. See, that is what happens in a city. The unexpected disaster, the unexpected encounter, it is, you know, you can't just have it completely your way. You can't have a cleansed space that pretends to be a city. No, what I mean is the unexpected. I mean, I arrived in this country as an immigrant with no money. My first job was as a cleaning woman. Indeterminacy was what is oxygen for me. I escaped my family, basically, right? So, but you know, I suffered, but it didn't matter. You know, there was a bigger force, and I see that with immigrants a lot, actually, that, you know, they work extremely hard, and one shouldn't have pity, because they have a project very often. I mean, sometimes, but so to me, indeterminacy is a mix. It's not, you know, the holy whatever. You know, it can have negative effects and consequences. It's just a feature of a system or of a systematicity, you know, whatever language here.
I was just going to say that I was struck by, in fact, I know the two of you were having a little bit of a debate about what is a city, but that aside, that I was struck by the similarity that both talks for me were an invitation to think about the city not as a bounded, fixed, spatio-temporal location, but precisely through other conceptual frameworks, be it right, talk, or indeterminacy. And I think that is an important takeaway for the purpose of this conference.
I agree completely. Next.
Oh, here, question.
Hi, I'm David Son. I'm a professor here at USC. I'm curious, I have two questions. One very quick one, Professor Roy. Did the Lees lose their house?
Good
Two,
question.
but it's tied to my second question, and that is, in listening to your story, it was really lovely, actually, but it worries me in the sense that, you know, we fight house to house. And in some sense, power comes out of systems change. And how do you move from the house to house to the systems change, like moving from the vendor to vendor to changing the rules around vending?
So that was precisely the point I wanted to convey, and that's why I did the ethnographic narrative, right? It's house by house, a small group of people doing it house by house. What I didn't show was, of course, I spent time with the movement going to the homes that have been occupied, and there is so much love and effort, we would call it sweat equity in analytical terms, that have gone into restoring these homes, but people are in there for no more than a year or two before they're out. So, in fact, yes, of course, this movement, along with others, are trying to think about new legalities. But as I said, in the US, there doesn't seem to be a viable legal and political pathway for these occupations to become a way of rethinking property rights. And even the community land trust route is a very limited one. So that is partly the point I'm making.
Thank you. We had a question here in the front.
So we heard quite a bit
So
about.
who are you first?
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Lily Song. I'm completing a postdoc at the University College London, and also starting a research position on transformative urban transport in the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And my question today is about state planning. So we heard quite a bit about social movement, urban social movement, and places of potentiality and creating change. And I was wondering what you thought about state planning. Do you think it's always defined in opposition to what, you know, Poor People's Movement or other urban progressive movements want? Are they always defending the political or economic status quo, or do you see a role for transformative political leadership at the local level? I mean, we're coming from studying cities, secondary cities in Indonesia, where they've elected, or Solo, for instance, elected Jokowi before he rose to the Indonesian presidency, and he was known for quite a few, progressive policies at the local level. And so I was wondering if you see any potential for collaboration between civil society and state planners, or whether it's going to be, tense or conflict-driven.
Margaret, you want to?
Definitely, especially at the local level, I think that there is often a responsiveness. And I'm not sure what level of government Raphael is actually thinking about, but I think local governments have proven to be, in some cases, not all, the level where you can really get response and that it has the most immediate effect. And it can be transformative in a small scale, but over multiple occasions, in multiple locales, it's very important.
Right, I think that local governments, mayors, it varies enormously how they function, but some mayors have a lot of power. They can make a lot of difference. Secondly, systemically speaking, there is a lot of downscaling. When you privatize and deregulate, you take functions out of legislatures or parliaments, oversight functions. But the functions don't disappear, but they become private specialized services that are in the city. So that becomes more the domain often of local government than of national government. There is a long list of downscalings that has happened because of privatization and deregulation. Just to mention those two. Then there are all kinds of other things. So I think that today, many people say around the world, this is a global phenomenon, that local governments, it doesn't happen everywhere, but in many places, local governments are taking on multiple functions. The Chinese have produced special jurisdictions to give big cities like Beijing, Shanghai, etc., authority. A kind of authority that none of the other cities have. So it's a very complex sort of trend that manifests in many different ways, across the world.
And it is, the devolution of authority
Yes,
is actually, it can go both ways, right? So to the extent that you devolve and contract out, whoever you contract out to then is the arbiter of the rules, right? And they can be either expansive
Good or
and
bad.
inclusive, or they can
Yeah.
be restrictive to try to simplify their circumstance. So
Yeah.
Yeah. 2 points in relation to that question. One, in the broadest conceptual sense, the reason I made that little quip about is there a planning profession in the US, even though I have a professional degree in urban planning, is because I like to think about planning following Polanyi, laissez-faire is planned, planning is not. That what we're looking at as these urban processes, say of redlining on the south side of Chicago, is in fact very much produced by state action. So what we hope to undo as progressive planners was in fact very much produced by our profession in the first place. So what we think of as planned and unplanned perhaps requires a bit of reconceptualization. But I think the second piece of this is being attentive to which issues can be addressed at which scale of government. That there are some things that progressive cities have taken on, for sure.
Refuge cities.
Yes.
Madrid and
The-
Barcelona.
The drive to increase the minimum wage.
Right.
Right.
Right?
Minimum wage, right.
The legalization of gay marriage started in San Francisco. So there's a way in, but there are all sorts of issues that that have to be taken up at other scales, be they county level
Right.
interventions. And there, I still hold up hope for the role of the national government.
Let's go in the back, yellow shirt.
Hi, my name is Nick, and I was going to ask you if you could share your thoughts on just kind of what's going on in Los Angeles. We have had poor people's movements here, like the bus riders unit, but I don't know, they have not been getting media coverage compared to what could be done in this city. We do have a lot of real estate problems. We have a housing crisis. We have problems with the law enforcement, and then there's a lot of foreign investment here and a lot of domestic, local government focus on developing tourism. So I'd be interested to hear how the topics you all talked about today interact in this context where many of us live and work.
Well, I'll give a thing at the end because I am not an expert on Los Angeles. Here.
Yes, I was going to say,
Margaret, the expert on Los Angeles.
Not having lived here for quite a while now, but I would just say I'm writing a book about Los Angeles that has been ongoing for a number of years. And I feel that Los Angeles had a moment after the riots in 1992 in which it could have reinvented itself on the basis of what was present, but instead it went in the opposite direction and decided to become a city like other cities and to change in ways that really disempower poor people and movements like the Bus Riders Union or other immigrant-based movements. And so I think there was that moment of opportunity that Ananya talked about was there. And now to me, the city, and this is probably not a popular position, especially with this audience, but to me the city is actually moved backwards away from really acknowledging its its complexity and diversity and allowing a lot of bottom-up activities to reshape itself. And instead, it's just following the same path of everybody else with highly conventional ideas of what the good city is.
So I will dispute that a little bit, just to the point that I think that the current mayor with the Great Streets initiative has as his goal every street to decide what makes it great, right? Acknowledging that within the city there is a diversity of visions about what my neighborhood should look like, what the norms should be on the street, and all those sorts of things. Those, I mean, I think there's been a tension in this conversation and in the presentations about the micro versus the macro, right? Because I do feel like the foreign capital investment, that's a macro trend that is going to have a different scale of impacts than the house to house or the park to park or the street to street dynamic, right? And you know, I didn't answer the question about agency, but if I were asked the question, I'm asking myself the question, I would say I actually don't think that in this country individuals do have agency. And I think in this country we've actually moved to less agency over the last 20 years than more, certainly in terms of federal government, and in many ways in terms of the local government. And the question is sort of what are the dynamics that can get us to start to move in the other direction? What are the circumstances? And this is one of the reasons why I think this conference is quite interesting, because this public space contestation is really a wrestling around, I'm going to reclaim my agency, right? I am going to reserve space and agency so that the regular people, the poor people, the non-moneyed and powerful interests actually have a say in what happens.
Can I just add one thing to that? I'm new to Los Angeles. I'm very much looking forward to being a student of the city, but also thinking about its incredible history of organizing and the various issues that exist here that exist all around the world. You know, what the state of emergency regarding homelessness, for example, means. But Los Angeles to me is such an interesting city, not just because of the contrast between wealth and poverty, or between sort of the mayor's office trying to deal with pressing problems and long-standing social movements also dealing with similar problems. But there is this whole, visible in Los Angeles is a whole nother infrastructure of mediation, which for lack of a better term, I'm going to call, well, the two possible terms, both are problematic. One would be philanthrocapitalism, another would be the non-profit industrial complex, right?
Both of them problematic, right?
Both problematic. We need a new vocabulary. But I think the recent furor over the Broad Museum is a good example of this, and the protests around it, because of the involvement of the Broad family in the charter school movement, is in the same way that in Seattle, the Gates Foundation crystallizes these contradictions. Of course, we're seeing not only increasing income and wealth inequality, we are then seeing that top 0.1% seeking to reform all forms of public administration and governance, and as viable players, for better or for worse. And I don't think we discuss that often enough. For me, LA is a city where these forces are really becoming visible, and in fascinating ways, and in a way that's a bit different from the Silicon Valley venture capitalists also trying to improve the world.
Well, I'd like to welcome you to LA, and we're having more of those conversations. For a last comment.
Yeah, so when I spent some time in Los Angeles, and here was the birth of vendors organizing. I remember at that time, this was early 1980s, there was a Salvadoran woman who became the chief of all the vendors. Most of the vendors were men. It was extraordinary. Secondly, justice for janitors started here. And the third one was the attempt to do a home workers union. They called it a home workers union. Now we have one in New York, you know, which has only worked in certain areas. So for me, my experience in Los Angeles was one of, you know, the brutality of the police, the absolute indifference of the rich, Hollywood and all of that, and all the others. And then so many different immigrants, so many Latinos also, a lot of activism, something that in New York played very, very differently. So anyhow, I wanted to just bring that. You know that I think there are very interesting older histories here that I'm sure are still at play in one way or another, that are feeding maybe these mobilizations that you see now.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Ananya Roy, Margaret Crawford, Saskia Sassen, thank you so much for kicking off our conference.